Long before cigarettes came in neat paper packs, before glowing signs hung above tobacco shops, and before smoke curled from the mouths of movie stars, tobacco was something completely different. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples of the Americas cultivated tobacco and used it in ceremonies, medicine, diplomacy, and social rituals. Smoke could carry spiritual meaning. Tobacco could seal agreements or mark important occasions. Nobody in those communities could have imagined that this plant would one day feed a global industry producing billions of cigarettes. The transformation began when Europeans crossed the Atlantic. In 1492, Christopher Columbus's expedition encountered people in the Caribbean using tobacco. Europeans soon saw dried tobacco leaves being smoked in forms unfamiliar to them. Sailors carried the habit back across the ocean, and within decades tobacco was spreading through European ports. At first, Europeans treated the strange American plant almost like a wonder drug. During the 16th century, tobacco acquired a reputation for supposed medicinal properties. Jean Nicot, the French diplomat, whose name would eventually be associated with nicotine, promoted tobacco at the French court. Physicians and merchants made extravagant claims about what the plant could do. But tobacco did not remain a medical curiosity for long. By the early 17th century, smoking had become fashionable in parts of Europe. Pipes appeared in taverns and homes. Merchants discovered that Europeans were willing to pay heavily for the leaves arriving from across the Atlantic. That demand transformed the American colonies. In Virginia, English colonist John Rolfe helped establish a commercially successful tobacco crop in the early 1600s. Tobacco exports became extraordinarily important to the colony. Fields spread across the landscape as planters chased profits from European demand. But the wealth came with a brutal human cost. Tobacco cultivation required enormous amounts of labor. European indentured servants initially supplied part of that workforce, while the colonial economy increasingly became dependent on enslaved African labor. Plantations expanded, ships crossed the Atlantic, and tobacco became deeply connected to the economic system of slavery. A plant once cultivated within indigenous societies had been absorbed into a vast Atlantic commercial machine. Still, the modern cigarette barely existed. For centuries, tobacco was consumed in several ways. People smoked it in pipes, inhaled powdered snuff, chewed it, or rolled tobacco into cigars. Cigarette-like forms existed in different places, but they remained relatively minor compared with other methods. Then war helped change everything. During the 19th century, cigarettes became increasingly visible in Europe. Soldiers encountered different tobacco habits as armies and cultures mixed. The Crimean War of the 1850s is often associated with helping popularize cigarette smoking among British soldiers, who encountered forms of tobacco rolled in paper. A cigarette had an obvious advantage. It was small. It was portable. It required no pipe. A smoker could carry several, light one quickly, and throw away what remained. But there was still a problem: making them. Hand-rolling cigarettes was slow. Skilled workers could produce them, but human hands placed a natural limit on how many could be manufactured. Then, in the United States, a machine changed the mathematics. In 1880, inventor James Bonsack patented a cigarette rolling machine. Instead of relying entirely on workers rolling cigarettes individually, machinery could manufacture them at extraordinary speed. For tobacco businessmen, this was revolutionary. James Buchanan Duke recognized what mass production could mean. Duke's company adopted Bonsack's technology and aggressively expanded cigarette production and marketing. Suddenly, cigarettes could be manufactured in quantities that would have been difficult to imagine only decades earlier. The cigarette was becoming an industrial product. Factories could make huge numbers of nearly identical cigarettes. Packaging became standardized. Distribution networks carried them into stores. Advertising pushed them toward new customers, and that created another problem. If factories could make cigarettes faster than existing smokers could consume them, companies needed more smokers. So the battle moved from the factory floor into people's minds. Tobacco companies became sophisticated advertisers. Cigarette packages carried collectible cards. Brand names became recognizable. Posters presented smoking as fashionable, sophisticated, adventurous, masculine, elegant, or modern, depending on the audience being targeted. The product itself was tiny. The story wrapped around it was enormous. By the early 20th century, the cigarette was no longer merely tobacco inside paper. It could represent an identity. Then the world went to war. When World War I began in 1914, millions of men entered trenches, camps, ships, hospitals, and military bases. Cigarettes were lightweight, easy to distribute, and offered soldiers a brief ritual during long periods of stress and boredom. They became deeply embedded in military life. Cigarettes were distributed through relief organizations and military supply systems, and soldiers received tobacco in parcels from home. Photographs from the period repeatedly show men smoking in trenches and camps. For tobacco companies, war exposed millions of young men to cigarettes under extraordinary circumstances. When soldiers returned home, the habit returned with them. Cigarette consumption rose dramatically during the first half of the 20th century. Factories became larger, advertising became more powerful. Brands fought for attention in newspapers, magazines, billboards, radio, and eventually television. But half the population still represented a complicated market. Smoking by women had long carried social stigma in many Western societies. Tobacco companies recognized both the restriction and the enormous commercial opportunity behind it. During the 1920s, advertising increasingly connected cigarettes with women's changing social roles, fashion, independence, and slimness. One famous American campaign promoted Lucky Strike cigarettes with the slogan, "Reach for a lucky instead of a sweet." The message was carefully constructed. A cigarette was being sold not simply as tobacco, but as an accessory to a modern identity. In 1929, a publicity stunt in New York became especially famous. Women smoking cigarettes during the Easter Sunday parade were presented to the press as lighting torches of freedom, linking public smoking with women's emancipation. Whether someone smoked could now be influenced by far more than taste. Advertising connected cigarettes with glamour, romance, rebellion, sophistication, military toughness, celebrity, and success. Hollywood magnified the image. On cinema screens, smoke could transform a simple conversation. A detective leaned beneath a street lamp with a cigarette glowing between his fingers. A glamorous actor exhaled smoke across a nightclub table. Soldiers shared cigarettes before danger. The cigarette became a visual prop. And because movies traveled internationally, that image traveled too. By the middle of the 20th century, cigarettes had become extraordinarily common in many countries. Ashtrays appeared in offices, restaurants, trains, aircraft, hotels, and homes. Smoking could happen during meetings, meals, journeys, and social gatherings. But while the cigarette industry was reaching enormous scale, scientists were investigating something much darker. Doctors had noticed increases in lung cancer. During the first half of the 20th century, researchers began examining possible explanations. By the 1950s, major epidemiological studies provided powerful evidence connecting cigarette smoking with lung cancer. The implications were enormous. This was not an obscure product used by a tiny group. Cigarettes were consumed by huge populations and supported one of the world's most powerful consumer industries. A confrontation between science, business, government, and culture was beginning. In 1950, researchers including Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill published influential findings in Britain linking smoking with lung cancer. Other research reached similar conclusions. Evidence continued accumulating. Then, in 1964, the United States Surgeon General released a landmark report on smoking and health. Its conclusions helped fundamentally change public understanding of cigarettes. Imagine the contrast. For decades, consumers had seen advertisements connecting cigarettes with doctors, athletes, celebrities, adventure, and sophistication. Now, government health authorities were warning that cigarette smoking was associated with serious disease. The image surrounding the cigarette began to fracture. But changing a culture built over generations would not happen overnight. Tobacco companies continued advertising aggressively. The industry challenged interpretations of scientific evidence and emphasized uncertainty. Meanwhile, researchers kept producing new findings. Governments gradually began intervening. Warning labels appeared on cigarette packaging. Advertising restrictions expanded. Television cigarette advertising disappeared in some countries. Taxes increased. Public health campaigns showed consequences that glamorous advertisements had ignored. Then another question became increasingly important. What about the people breathing the smoke around smokers? Research into second-hand smoke added a new dimension to the debate. Smoking was no longer framed solely as a personal decision affecting the person holding the cigarette. Smoke could also expose family members, co-workers, restaurant customers, and other people nearby. That changed the politics of public space. During the late 20th and early 21st centuries, smoking restrictions spread through workplaces, restaurants, public transportation, aircraft, bars, and other shared environments in many countries. Places that once seemed inseparable from cigarette smoke began changing. The transformation was remarkable. A few generations earlier, cigarette advertisements could appear almost everywhere. Smoking could be depicted as glamorous and ordinary. Now packages in many countries carried increasingly prominent health warnings. Advertising faced strict limits, and smokers were often required to move outside. But the cigarette did not disappear. The tobacco industry expanded across international markets, particularly as smoking rates declined in some wealthier countries. Global companies competed across Asia, Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. The geography changed, but the business remained enormous. And then technology disrupted tobacco again. Electronic cigarettes emerged commercially in the 21st century, creating a new nicotine market built around devices that heat liquids rather than burn tobacco in the traditional cigarette form. Their rise triggered another round of arguments about addiction, health risks, harm reduction, regulation, and marketing. The object had changed. The underlying commercial battle over nicotine had not disappeared. Today, the cigarette looks almost absurdly simple. Shredded tobacco wrapped inside a small paper cylinder, usually with a filter at one end. But almost nothing about its history is simple. Behind that little cylinder sits a story stretching across centuries. It begins with indigenous tobacco traditions in the Americas. It passes through European exploration and colonial plantations, through slavery and Atlantic commerce, through 19th century factories and machines capable of turning tobacco into a mass-produced commodity. Then come advertising agencies, soldiers, movie stars, doctors, scientists, corporate executives, lawmakers, and public health campaigns. Few everyday objects have moved through so many different identities. Tobacco was sacred, then medicinal, then profitable, then fashionable, then industrial, then glamorous, and eventually increasingly recognized as dangerous. The cigarette conquered much of the world, not because one person invented it on one afternoon, but because hundreds of years of trade, technology, empire, advertising, war, culture, and addiction gradually transformed a plant into one of history's most successful consumer products. And that may be the strangest part of its history. The cigarette itself barely changed in appearance, while everything around it changed completely. An object that once symbolized modernity eventually became a symbol of one of the largest public health struggles of the modern age. The tiny paper cylinder stayed roughly the same. What humanity believed about it did not.